be looking at now is some of the global issues around this transition to quantum safe or post-quantum cryptography. We've heard what the industry is doing. We've heard, or we will hear from Luke and Laurie and other members of the task force on what the GSMA is doing. So, how does government, how does industry, how does civil society actually respond to what may be one of the largest security updates in a generation? We've all forgotten what cryptography is about. Everybody thinks about WhatsApp messages, but we don't think about how we secure credit card transactions. We don't think about how we secure the software in your electric vehicles, the identity management when you log on to systems, the cloud platforms that you use. So obviously it's a major shift. But we've got 4 panelists here. What I'm going to ask is for everybody to spend a minute or so, introduce yourself, where you come from, and for a bit of fun, tell us how you got involved in the transition to quantum safety. So Gary, starting with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Gary Trotman. I work for Digital Catapult, and we are an advisory body partly funded by the UK government. So I am head of technology solutions at the Catapult. So in terms of quantum, the government announced its initiative in 2023, their 10-year quantum strategy. And we will look at how that strategy is implemented, the various elements of quantum safe networks being a part of that. And in our advisory capacity, we advise on how these quantum safe can be implemented on networks. We already lead one of the most important government programs, that's the Open RAN disaggregation, and how we can build that into those programs.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Great to be on this panel. Great to see so many people here in the room. Although this is a session that doesn't have AI in its title, and still so many people here, so it's quite impressive. I'm on the executive committee of the World Economic Forum and co-heading what we call the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. You could basically call it the technology unit of the World Economic Forum, where we help decision makers in government and business and civil society anticipate the impact of exponential technologies and anticipate and accelerate their responsible adoption. What we are focusing on a lot is this question of an adaptation gap. Technology moves oftentimes at an exponential path. Institutions, infrastructures, if at all, at a more linear path, that creates a tension, and that tension, of course, creates unrealized opportunity and unprecedented risks. And I think we have a big focus here on the unprecedented risks. Quantum computing, quantum sensing, quantum communication is for a couple of years now on the agenda of the World Economic Forum. It was interestingly at the very beginning part of various teams. We looked at it through a cyber angle, through an AI lens, through a tech governance perspective, and only recently it became a larger team at the World Economic Forum. And that team has done quite fantastic work, also with Sandbox AQ on things like quantum principles and quantum blueprint for economies that are in this transition. So that got me involved in this work and excited to be here.
Thank you. Now I will turn to... I'm never going to live this down. And now I'll turn to Darren and say, give us a background of what you're doing and how you've come about here.
Thanks, Ig. So Darren Ennis, I'm the head of EU affairs for Vodafone and also director of Vodafone Belgium. Why am I here? Well, at Vodafone, if Luke asks you to do something, you basically do it. But in all seriousness, I think people will have seen this morning, Commissioner Breton obviously gave a keynote speech in which obviously this was at the heart of it. So it's very much in conversations among policymakers and politicians, both in Brussels and at a national level. And ourselves at Vodafone and Laurie, her counterparts, my counterparts at IBM, we're sort of engaged at trying to increase awareness and education of policymakers and politicians so that we prepare properly. So the EU doesn't necessarily make the same mistakes it may have done in the past when it comes to, you know, regulatory framework. So in the same spirit as, you know, developing regulation for AI, we think that regulation in this sphere is an important and needs to be a top priority for EU policymakers. So that's why I'm here. Also, just finally, just to mention, I noticed NATO was mentioned. That's also the responsibility of my office, and actually I can honestly say that, again, probably at least 2 out of 3 conversations we have with our counterparts at NATO seem to certainly have this on their agenda as well. But I leave it to Luke and to Laurie to be the experts. I just try and enable them to make it a priority of policymakers and politicians.
Perhaps you'd like to share your perspective from South Korea, which is one of the world leaders in quantum technology.
Yeah. Good afternoon. So my name is Keundae. Pronunciation is so difficult because of Korean name. I'm head of network security division of IITP in South Korea, not North Korea. Yes, IITP is the organization that comprehensively promote national ICT policy establishment and national technology development, human resource trainings and infrastructure development project to promote ICT technology industries. I'm participating in this seminar because I'm in charge of the mobile and satellite communication and cybersecurity and quantum communication. I share my opinions based on the career cases. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we've heard various comments about starting to prepare and the importance of planning. So I think one question is why now? Why are we suddenly taking action in the area of post-quantum? Why don't we wait a few years? And let me turn to you and ask you what you think. Why is now the time for us to be involved? The World Economic Forum has been publishing papers in this space, so what drove that action?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, that works, no? Well, first of all, I think what holds true for all technologies is that we have a tendency to overestimate what these technologies can do in the short term and underestimate what these technologies can do in the long term. And part of our work at the forum is to change that in the minds and hearts of decision makers. And that's why we have put quantum on the agenda. If I would summarize a couple of points, one is pure strategic foresight. I think Francis called it a generational technology. It's not a technology, it's a technology paradigm that's going to change more or less every sector, every industry. And since the telco industry interacts with every sector and every industry, it should be very much at the forefront of these developments. It's of course also about future readiness because many of the investments are very long term and pay off over years, if not over decades. It's very much about trust and performance when it comes to telcos. On the one hand, there's the security question, and we have heard, I think, abundantly about the security threats, but let's not forget that quantum technology can also, on the upside, have positive implications for performance and capacity, and also on the security side, it can do things like anomaly detection better, etc. So it can also have an upside and not just the downside. But maybe from a forum perspective, the last point is really system leadership and systems change. It's a complicated thing to do. It's not a technical challenge. It's about computers, but in the end it involves human beings. And human beings, and to align hearts and minds, that's hard work and it takes a long period of time. And that's why we believe that we need to create the foundations now in terms of the communities, the insight, the tools, the frameworks that then allow people to act when it's really necessary and to really have this on-ramp. So that's why we got into this.
Okay. Now, Dr. Kim, if I look at the Korean national strategy, there's about 650 pages on quantum, which I think is great. So from your perspective, again, similarly, why is now the time for us to be acting around the post-quantum transition?
Telecommunications cryptography is used for a wide variety of the application, including the data protections between the wired and wired network, device and user authentication, and more. If the advantage of the quantum computing is to break the existing cryptography, trusted communication will be impossible and disruptive. Therefore, quantum transition to PQC is essential for the telecommunication industries. But it's not easy to make the transition in a short time. In South Korea, for example, it took more than a decade to increase the security strength of the national encryption system. As the era of quantum computing is approaching, I believe it is time to gather the experts to discuss the establish a master plan for the transition to PQC and telecommunications. Thanks.
Thank you. And perhaps Darren, if I can ask you, you already mentioned some of the discussions from this morning. Why is now the time when telecoms needs to be taking action here?
Well, if I listen to your first speaker, now is already too late. So I suppose we definitely need to progress the conversation. I think, look, I can talk from a EU perspective, and I think as a telecoms, from the telecoms, one of the things that we suffer from is fragmentation of the regulatory framework, uncertainty, divergence, and we need to basically, make sure that doesn't happen when it comes to this matter. But also, we're seeing AI now. I think it's a similar challenge there, and I think what we need is, and it's good to see that Commissioner Breton with his white paper and the upcoming Digital Networks Act, that they will take this holistic approach where we need to take a holistic approach, be it AI, be it quantum, but also you look at the architecture. I just made a note. I was going to mention about Open RAN and the developments there. So now is the time, but now is the time for definitely for a more holistic and harmonized approach. First of all in the EU, but also globally, because in our conversations with the European Commission, the good news is I think they see that it has to go beyond, whatever they do, has to go beyond the borders of the EU. They talk about like-minded nations or G7 or even cooperation with NATO. So I think the conversation is happening, but based on what we were told earlier from, as I said, your first speaker, we need to accelerate the conversation and accelerate the work on the regulatory framework.
Okay. So Gary, if I can turn to you, I mean, you operate a slightly different area. You run test beds, you run infrastructure to test out some of these new concepts like open disaggregated networks. So from your perspective, why now? Are we at the right time to be starting to test these concepts out in sorts of infrastructure that you provide to the operators and the rest of the community?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about Open RAN and disaggregation of networks. With that brings a whole new set of security issues, whereas before you had single vendors who owned the RAN and they could build the end-to-end stack. Now you've disaggregated 3 parts of the RAN, and then you've got the RAN intelligent controller on top, and you've got X apps and R apps and all kinds of things that are being built. So it's important to start thinking about that now. So the only issue we have is that right now a lot of the algorithms that are required to start running these tests don't exist. So that's another thing that Catapult does. We're going to start looking at where is the next generation of algorithm writers. Well, I can tell you where they are. They're in high school and junior school now, right? Yes, we've got a lot of academia in the universities, but we need to bring that through in a sustainable manner and be able to test those algorithms in an environment, not just on paper, which a lot of the research organizations do. We are what we call a TRO, technical research organization. So as you said, we have the various test beds. We've got Open RAN test beds. We've got the traditional 5G test beds. We've got something like, in our Open RAN environment, something like 26 products from 22 vendors. So once we get through this step change with the government as part of this Open RAN project, then we can start looking at using that for other things, and that's looking at quantum. So we already have been out to industry and started asking them about their challenges, perceived challenges, and where they need to start. Everyone thinks, oh, we need to be quantum safe straight away. But as your initial presentation, no, because a lot of them don't even know what they have. So how can you secure something against an attack when you don't even know what you have? So that's where it all starts, and that's something that we can do now, we are doing now.
Okay. So I think that's an interesting example. We've seen a lot of leadership from the United States in the NIST process, which is defining the new algorithms that everyone will use, and I think everyone's looking forward to the NIST conference in April, and hopefully we'll see those finally published as standards. And we've also seen from the US National Security Agency publishing a timeline to show what the transition period looks like from the US federal government. And you can sort of see over the next decade we need to do work. But that then leaves me, okay, so we've seen government leadership there, and we've seen industry leadership here with the GSMA. But if I turn to you, Sebastian, and say, well, you're also taking a lead here with the World Economic Forum. What do you think you need to do? What do you think are the things that are important in terms of getting skills, information, awareness out into the community?
Well, maybe briefly to explain to the group about what the World Economic Forum is, right, and how we work. We are an international organization. We're not in that sense a civil society organization. We are an international organization for public-private cooperation, bringing indeed civil society, business, academia, government, and other stakeholders together. So in the end, what we do is we are providing an impartial platform within which the necessary information exchange and trust building can happen. And the transition that you're describing in the end is not a simple technical challenge, although there's a lot of technical jargon that we all are using. In the end, it's a complex adaptive challenge. And how is that different? It's different in the sense that even the end goal is not always entirely clear, and it is something that needs to be negotiated. So you need to have all stakeholders in the room, and all stakeholders build trust, maybe even some sort of shared identity or shared language to engage in that ongoing process. And that's a process that we are trying to give structure to, and that we're trying to give structure to also by taking complex technical topics and then elevating them to the C-suite level or above, where much of the decision making needs to happen, but the information is not necessarily present. So what is an organization like the World Economic Forum doing concretely? We are focusing on 3 major areas. One is rebuilding understanding, really sharing with decision makers regularly what is the state of quantum computing. Then we focus a lot on tools and frameworks for industry and sectoral transformation. We're working particularly with nation states on that. And for me, quantum is a little bit like space in the sense that every nation will become a quantum nation at some point, if it wants to or if it doesn't want to. And on the space side, it's the same. Even if you don't have launch capacity, and most countries don't have launch capacity and will never have launch capacity, will also somehow want to benefit from the space age and from the space economy. So we are working particularly with emerging economies on blueprints and frameworks to help them transition into that area, work that we have done with IBM and Sandbox and others. And then, of course, we are trying to support a knowledge sharing when it comes to cybersecurity, a topic that is very prominent here, where we are looking into quantum secure economies, and very specifically quantum secure financial services, financial systems work that we have carried out with the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK.
Actually, going back to that thought about, you're talking about developing capability at the board level and at a broader level. I mean, Gary, you've got within the Catapult lots of vendors, you've got the ecosystem that makes telecoms work. Do you see that you can bring those companies together to test, both to develop their understanding, but also to build out examples of this?
Yeah, absolutely, and we've already got that foresight in place, and we're building our various programs around that. So we are an innovation agency. The clue's in the name. So at the moment, yes, we've got that open RAN infrastructure, indoor, outdoor, etc. That's fine. As I said before, about the other face of Digital Catapult is we do a lot of outreach as well, accelerator programs. So we have technology access programs where we provide facilities whereby people can, with the interest in quantum, and there are capabilities at a certain level. And I don't mean in terms of quantum, because there aren't that many around, but in terms of basic programming, they can come along and they can have a play, let's say, with quantum, get used to quantum, because you have to put it in their hands and let them get a touch and a feel for it. But at the same time, these accelerator programs, they're going to be structured whereby they're building towards something. You know, what will these algorithms look like? So we've got the scale-ups and the startups and academia on one side, but we've also got industry on the other side. So industry saying to us what they feel they need to be quantum safe moving forward, where their vulnerabilities are today. But not only that, some of the industries, if you take energy, for instance, they're on very long lead times for their R&D, etc. So they need to be building that into whatever they're doing now, and to do that, they need to know what's available to do that, but also they need to know what they have now, and then how they're going to build that into their solutions.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of research that's being published on both the analysis of the potential algorithms that we'll be using, but also on the implications on particular industries. And I think, interestingly enough, Canada seems to be in the lead in that regard with Michele Mosca and the Forum for Digital Infrastructure Resilience, which is part of Industry Canada, publishing some really good stuff on, you know, the implications for financial services. And in fact, only last week we had the Monetary Authority of Singapore publish guidance to all the CEOs of all the financial institutions there, saying, you know, start to plan for this. But therefore, this leads to the question, which I think I'll ask both Dr. Kim and Darren. So what do you think is the role of government here in terms of starting to make those industry-specific or nation-specific, now is the time to start planning? I mean, do you think now is an appropriate time for that sort of guidance?
Critical river systems is used both public and private sectors, including the major infrastructure such as transportations and communications and healthcare in the public services, as well as the online shopping malls and internet in the private sector. RSA public key is cryptographic switches is analyzed to be vulnerable to the attacks by the quantum computer. It is currently the most cryptographic technology. In addition, the public and private sectors have recently been networked and often drops to each other. In managing a risk of the quantum computing, it will be necessary for the government to establish and integrate people's transaction plans without distinguish between the government and the private sector. Establish standards for interconnections and understanding them together with the private sector. I think so. Yeah.
And Darren, I mean, you've already mentioned some of the positive aspects coming out of Commissioner's speech this morning.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, governments and the European Union have both an imperative and a responsibility to, legislate and regulate in this area. But picking up on your point a moment ago, the problem in the European Union is who and where, right? That's always the point. So I think certainly from Vodafone's perspective, yes, obviously at a national level there is a role, but we also see a role at EU level in terms of setting a clear strategy, harmonisation, but also looking at the cross-sectoral approach, right? Because, if you look at the range, it goes from defence across to education into even, digital and precision agriculture, if you take it that far. So we see a role both at EU level and at national level for setting a strategy and having intervention. I just wanted to pick up on a previous point, and I think it's really important, and it is about skills, because we have a lot of these conversations and they can be not a lot very tangible, but one thing is skills, right? And I can tell you certainly from Europe, we have a lack of, we're way behind when it comes to cyber skills, when it comes to digital skills. And I think whatever the strategy that's taken from a regulatory or a legislative perspective has to be hand in hand with a skills strategy that underpins this, because if we look at pandemic, we went, I think we went 10 years in the space of 3 years in terms of digitalization, right? That acceleration is only continuing. So we need to have, a future. We need to be future-proofing that. So a skills strategy, I think, is also key for governments to start to implement from a bottom-up perspective.
And we heard from Francis earlier that there are multiple sectors that are impacted by this transition. Healthcare, as you said, agriculture, government in general, telecoms. What do you think about the prioritization in terms of which sectors you want to start with? I mean, obviously Vodafone's leading with itself.
Yeah, I mean, one is quite clear, right? So, defense and national security clearly has to be the priority number one for governments and lawmakers, because that essentially gives us the air cover to make sure that it's safe and secure in everything we're approaching. But I think the other piece that we need to keep in mind is whatever regulatory framework or policy making that is made, it's done with the right balance, because we've talked a lot about the threat, but we need to remember it's also an opportunity. And I think that's really, so where there are opportunities in certain sectors, I think we need to really scale up and accelerate, while at the same time keeping in mind we need to have a level playing field, and one which is safe and secure, that we're globally all operating in. It's sort of like the playground needs to have the rails around it, but I think we shouldn't stop letting people do a little playing as well at the same time, so we can have the innovation and scaling up that's required.
I mean, that was an interesting observation, because I know in London, when UK Finance published their 2 papers, one was on the opportunities of the quantum economy and the other was then on the risk. But that general understanding of risk and what's required, I think is probably important. And I think that's where potentially government has a role in order to raise that awareness. And Sebastian, from your perspective, how do you see governments doing that? What do you think is good practice in terms of helping everyone to understand both risk and opportunity?
Yeah, government in some case can raise awareness, and sometimes government awareness needs to be raised. I think that depending on where you are, it probably goes in both directions. Government clearly has an opportunity to put the topic on the agenda. It has an opportunity to invest into upskilling, and I think we might go into the skills topic a little bit later. And it also has an opportunity to highlight cases that work, highlight best practices, and in that way foster shared understanding. Maybe to give you one example, the government of the UK reached out to us. I mentioned earlier the Financial Conduct Authority. Quantum secure financial services are a huge topic. I would say probably right next after national security. It's probably one of the next big areas. And they worked then with the World Economic Forum to raise awareness, but a little bit more than that, to build out principles, and on top of the principles to build out a roadmap. And that's what happened. The roadmap reads a little bit similar, Francis, to the little chart that you presented earlier, where the financial conduct authority said, okay, we first need to work on preparedness, build internal skills and capacity, then need to go into what they called clarification, which is to say, how do we actually engage between the public and the private sector? How do we work together? But also, what is the current regulatory landscape that we can already leverage so we don't reinvent the wheel? Yep. And then to go really into guidance to say, okay, where do we need to update regulations? Where do we need to set norms and standards? And do all of that in an iterative way, because again, this is an adaptive challenge. And many of the problems that exist, we don't even know about today. So we need to constantly go back and revisit what we're doing. So that's an example of how government is leveraging a platform like ours to raise awareness, but then also more forward, think about principles, think about roadmaps to orient stakeholders in the public and in the private sector.
Thank you. Now, I mean, one of the countries that I keep looking to as a example for what's happening with quantum is South Korea. So how in South Korea is government raising awareness of both the opportunity of quantum and the issues to do with the transition to quantum safe?
It's so difficult. Yeah.
I mean, you sponsor, the huge Quantum Korea conference, last year. And to give you an idea, the president of South Korea opened the conference with the keynote with thousands of people from around the world. I think that's an excellent example of that leadership.
Yeah. Because transaction is facing entitled public defense and private sector. The lack of the systemic protections can lead to significant disruption. So there's a need to raise awareness of the fixed transaction. In South Korea, the national master plan for fixed transaction was established in July 2023. Yes, with the participation of the experts from the industry, academia, and the research and government ministry in the charge of the public defense and private sectors for the transition by 2035. The government will collaborate with the Korean telecommunications companies and as portals in the private sector, as well as domestic and industrial standardization organization. And we is approaching to the prove the and make the quantum transaction in Korea. Yeah, we will now started the plan. Yes, and then we will finally make that in 2035. We will do that now.
Thank you. Now, Gary, do you think groups like Tech UK can help with raising awareness in this way and helping the industry to understand what they have to do?
Absolutely, and that's going to be one of the remits, bringing industry closer to, I think I mentioned before, the scale-ups and the startups and all these, the clever people that are going to build these algorithms to enable them to do what they need to do. There is a skills shortage, and that's been recognised, and that's why, coming back to the UK government, there is going to be funding available to address the skills shortage issue, and organisations such as the Digital Catapult will be at the forefront of that, building the, providing the right environment for these skills to flourish. And not only that, but finding these skill sets in the first place. What are the skill sets? So from talking to industry on one side and then finding out the requirements, looking at the threats of quantum and working with academia, scale-ups and startups. That's how we aim to bridge that gap.
Thank you. I think we all understand that different sectors, financial services, healthcare, are all impacted in different ways. And And some of those are heavily regulated. I mean, you can't just rock up and go, hey, I'm a bank, give me your money. Well, so I guess a good question to ask, and perhaps Darren, I can ask you, is when do you think it's the right time for that sector-specific regulation to start? We've already seen Singapore taking that answer. We've seen within the payments industry the idea that as of April next year, that cryptographic inventory, that plan for cryptographic agility is a requirement for anybody who takes card payments. But do you see now is the right time for governments to start looking, or the EU maybe, to start looking and saying, okay, let's think about some critical sectors and prioritise those?
Absolutely. First of all, I mean, it sounds like the EU is already well behind in terms of what we've just heard. We also know from a US perspective as well. So I think, from an EU perspective, there is no choice.
Yep.
What I think one option, and it's something now that I'm in this debate sort of reflecting on, and it's probably something we will take back to the Commission and the people who have come up with the white paper, but there is a consultation that has just been launched between now and the end of June, and which involves this. So I think now what I would say is I think that's the time for it to have that engagement. So I think the white paper and now the consultation is probably perfect timing for those sectors to contribute. It's not just a white paper for us as a telecom sector to engage on. I think given that quantum does stretch across, we're sort of like, we like to describe ourselves as sort of the digital enabler, the bit in the middle, right, that enables the verticals, and therefore I suppose the message would be to the verticals to look at that consultation and probably start the conversation now between now and June, and then take it beyond there. So I do think now is the time for that engagement.
Okay, and we're starting to see national cybersecurity agencies publishing their guidance, and I think I can count recently you've got the US, France, Germany, the Netherlands, I'm sure, the UK, and I think we're probably expecting that after April and the NIST conference, things will... So from your perspective, should we be expecting all of these processes to come together? Will we see revised guidance in parallel with the EU and other groups starting to...
Well, we'd hope so, because along with the white paper, there was another paper on submarine cables, but there was also an NIS report as well published at the same time. So we are hoping that the Commission and member states are getting the message that we need a harmonised approach. I think we would like to see an EU-wide strategy. That doesn't mean that the implementation all has to be carried out at an EU level, but certainly we would want to see a proper EU-wide strategy coming out, as I said, from, I think, this consultation. I think the other added bonus that we have, I think, from a European Union perspective is, of course, we have the elections in June, but that means that we have a new European Commission. It's probably the perfect time for that Commission to, place this at the top of the incoming Commissioner and the various DGs to put it in, the new policy program for the next 5 years. So it is an opportune time, I think, certainly from the EU.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time, and I think we've got time for one more question. So I'm going to skip forward and ask actually each of our panelists to talk about what they think is important in terms of building skills in this area. And I mean skills in our own organisation, skills in society and in government. The development of skills in the industry and government around quantum and post-quantum. What do you see as important there?
Maybe I come in. I
Yeah.
think I think what's needed is we need a sort of like which doesn't always happen. I think is knowledge sharing. I think between public and private partnership. I think that needs to start. I think the US has probably got a slightly better approach to that than let's say necessarily in Europe, and I think Europe could probably look to that. So I think it's definitely knowledge sharing, public, private, and then I think it's education and awareness right from the bottom up in terms of from curriculum through to universities. And I think we like to pride ourselves, I think, at Vodafone with some of our collaborative projects that we've got, with our foundation and other things in the education system. So I think it's about, this is really, skills is ultimately around where public and private partnership, that's the sweet spot. It's not just the responsibility of government, and it's not just, and it's, we also as private sector have a responsibility to enable government from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. Gary, if I can turn to you, you've got a huge ecosystem. How can groups like Digital Catapult actually contribute to the skills that we need?
Well, I think in terms of the skills shortage, it's not, I think I mentioned before that the geniuses of tomorrow are actually in junior and high school now, right? But you may be or you may not be surprised at the lack of skills within industry as well. So Digital Catapult, we held an industry day for quantum late last year. We concentrated on critical infrastructure, so that's energy industry. And they went from, the quote coming out of that a couple of days later is that they went from being quantum skeptic to quantum curious. And we had a follow-up session, I think it was last month, and they said we helped them get to quantum aware, and now they're quantum active. So they're actually looking at, as I said before, building it into their roadmap, but not just a case of, let's build quantum into the roadmap. What skills do they need to do that? How do they get those skills? In the meantime, the clock isn't going to stop ticking, so can you help us find people with those skills to help upskill us and take us along on that journey to that certain point whereby we can cut the ties and then we can stand on our own 2 feet, because as I said, the clock's ticking.
Thank you. And Sebastian, if I can end with you, what's the role of groups like the World Economic Forum in helping to develop those skills? And what do you think are the critical steps that everybody needs to take?
Well, the forum has tried to inform, not specifically for quantum, but in general, the skills debate by looking at skills gaps as a consequence of technological change. I think in the quantum context, some of the things have been said. I think STEM education is absolutely key. I think there are opportunities to invest into postgraduate research. At some point, a little bit further down the line, there will be questions around upskilling and cross-skilling. There are definitely questions around public-private partnerships. There need to be certain public goods in place in a country, like research facilities, etc., if you really meaningfully want to educate people. But I think the point I really want to highlight is that already, according to some figures, the demand for quantum skills outpaces the supply 3-to-1. And what does that mean in a market society? It means that people who have these skills will get paid more, and they will then also move to places where they get paid more. I think in our quantum economy blueprint, we pointed out one figure that the salaries for these kinds of experts in the US already double the ones in the UK, which will probably already not be too bad. So you can sort of go into other countries, right? So there is one other risk there attached to that. You will have sort of gravitational effects, you will have a skills shortage, and all of that could over time worsen the digital divide that's already here. So I think when we think about STEM education, when we think about skills, we also need to think about how can we upskill people in emerging economies that, as I said earlier, will inevitably also move into the quantum age. And we got to make sure that this is not going to worsen existing divisions in society, and that's one of the areas we're focusing on at the forum.
Thank you. Well, I think what we've seen is that there's a lot of activity happening around the world at policy level, at government level, and the one really positive thing I take away from this is I've been engaged with governments at multiple levels and with my colleagues here. This is an area people are now starting to focus on, and that's really good news. With that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your fascinating responses. And at that point, I will press the magic button, and they've already done it. But thank you.